In the winter of 1912, a column of 150,000 Russian soldiers trudged into the Siberian wilderness, their breath crystallizing in the minus 40 degrees Celsius air. They were retreating from the Chinese border, ordered by Tsar Nicholas II to march over 1,000 miles across the frozen taiga to safety. But safety never came. Within weeks, the march became a death sentence. Soldiers began to freeze where they stood, their bodies piling up like cordwood along the trail. By the time the last survivors stumbled into the town of Chita, over 50,000 men had perished, not from enemy fire, but from the silent, relentless grip of the cold. The White Death had claimed them. This is the story of the Great Siberian Ice March, one of history's most catastrophic military retreats, where the enemy was not a human army, but the land itself. To understand the White Death March, we must go back to the summer of 1912. Russia was locked in a simmering conflict with China over control of Manchuria. Tsar Nicholas II, eager to assert imperial dominance, had stationed over 200,000 troops along the Chinese border. But the campaign stalled. Supply lines stretched thin, and the Chinese forces proved more resilient than expected. By autumn, the Russian command realized they could not hold their positions. The decision was made: a full-scale retreat to the nearest secure Russian outpost, Chita, over 1,000 miles to the northwest. The route would cut through the heart of Siberia, a vast, unforgiving wilderness of frozen rivers, dense forests, and howling winds. The soldiers, mostly peasant conscripts from European Russia, had no experience with such extreme cold. They were issued only standard wool greatcoats and felt boots, woefully inadequate for the coming winter. The march began in October 1912 with spirits surprisingly high. The men sang folk songs as they left their makeshift camps, believing they would reach Chita in a few weeks. The early autumn weather was mild, with temperatures hovering just below freezing. The column stretched for miles, a serpentine line of men, horses, and wagons loaded with supplies. Local peasants, ordered to provide food and shelter, watched them pass with grim faces. The soldiers joked about the cold, calling it a Russian summer. But the optimists among them ignored the warnings of the Siberian natives, who spoke of the White Death, a phenomenon where sudden blizzards could drop temperatures to minus 50 degrees Celsius within hours. The first week passed without incident. The column made good progress, covering nearly 20 miles a day. The commanders felt confident. They had no idea that the worst winter in a century was about to descend upon them. By the second week, the first signs of trouble appeared. Temperatures began to plummet as a Siberian high-pressure system settled over the region. The ground, once soft, became iron-hard. The horses started to die, their hooves cracking on the frozen earth. The soldiers, still wearing their autumn uniforms, began to suffer from frostbite. Commanders noted that the supply of firewood was dwindling, the forests were sparse, and what wood they found was wet and difficult to burn. Desperate for warmth, men huddled together at night, but many woke up stiff and cold, their fingers blackened. The native guides urged the commanders to halt and build permanent shelters until spring. But the generals, under pressure from the Tsar to expedite the retreat, ignored them. They pushed on, believing that a faster pace would keep the men warm. It was a fatal miscalculation. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was becoming lethal. Despite the mounting hardships, the soldiers pressed on. The column now stretched over 30 miles, a thin line of humanity against the white expanse. The landscape was monotonous, endless snow-covered plains broken only by skeletal birch forests and frozen rivers. The men marched in silence, conserving energy. They had learned to wrap their faces in rags to prevent their breath from freezing their beards. Food was running low. Each man received only a handful of hardtack and a piece of salt pork per day. The horses, too weak to carry loads, were slaughtered for meat. The men ate raw, frozen horse meat, their mouths bleeding from the sharp edges. Despite it all, a grim camaraderie developed. Soldiers shared what little they had, helping the wounded and the weak. But the cold was a relentless enemy. Each night, more men failed to wake. The officers began to realize that they were marching into a trap of their own making. The crisis point came in late November, when the column reached the Khingan Mountains. The pass was narrow and the snow was deep, over 3 feet. The temperature dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius. The The wind howled, whipping snow into the men's faces, blinding them. The officers held a council. Some argued for halting and building snow caves until the storm passed. But the majority, driven by fear of the Tsar's wrath, decided to push through. It was a decision that sealed their fate. The men began to die in droves. They would sit down to rest and never get up. The trail became littered with frozen bodies, some still in marching positions. The living walked past the dead without a word, their eyes hollow. The horses, too, collapsed, their carcasses quickly buried by snow. The column began to disintegrate. Units lost contact with each other. Men wandered off, delirious from cold and hunger, never to be seen again. The catastrophe reached its peak in December. The column had lost all cohesion. Thousands of men staggered forward, their minds clouded by hypothermia. They began to hallucinate. Some saw warm fires and ran toward them, only to collapse in the snow. Others imagined they were home and began to undress, discarding their coats, a classic sign of paradoxical undressing in the final stages of hypothermia. The bodies piled up along the trail, entire battalions froze in place, their rifles still in hand, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. The wind scoured the snow, revealing grotesque tableaus. A group of men huddled around a dead campfire, frozen solid, a soldier kneeling, as if in prayer, his hands clasped. The officers lost all authority. The march became a stampede of the dying. By the end of December, over 80,000 men had perished. The peak horror came when the survivors reached the frozen Lake Baikal. The lake was a sheet of ice, but the wind across its surface was lethal. Men walked onto the ice, only to be frozen mid-step. The living walked among statues of the dead. Some soldiers, driven mad by the cold, began to eat the flesh of their fallen comrades. Others simply lay down and waited for death. The lake became a vast graveyard, with bodies stretching as far as the eye could see. The few remaining officers tried to maintain order, but it was futile. The men were beyond reason. They were a procession of ghosts. On the far shore, a small village offered shelter, but only a few hundred reached it. The rest perished on the ice, their bodies preserved by the cold for months. When spring came, the thaw revealed the full extent of the tragedy. Over 100,000 corpses scattered across the Siberian wilderness. By February 1913, the survivors began to trickle into Chita. They were gaunt, frostbitten, and barely alive. Many had lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs to gangrene. The local hospitals were overwhelmed. Of the original 150,000, fewer than 40,000 made it. The rest were dead, scattered along a 1,000-mile trail of frozen corpses. Rescue parties sent back along the route found horrific scenes. Entire battalions frozen in formation, horses still hitched to wagons, and personal diaries that chronicled the slow descent into madness. One diary entry read, "We are no longer men, we are walking dead." The Tsar, upon hearing the news, ordered a cover-up. The disaster was blamed on the Chinese and the weather. The families of the dead were told their loved ones had died in battle. The true scale of the catastrophe was hidden for decades, but the survivors never forgot. They called it the White Death March. The Great Siberian Ice March remains one of the deadliest military disasters in history, yet it is largely forgotten. It was a tragedy born of arrogance, ignorance, and the brutal indifference of nature. The Tsar's ambition, the general's stubbornness, and the soldiers' obedience combined to create a catastrophe that claimed over 100,000 lives. In the aftermath, the Russian military learned little. Similar disasters would occur in World War I and the Russian Civil War. But for those who survived, the memory was indelible. They carried the scars of frostbite and the ghosts of their comrades. The White Death March stands as a grim testament to the limits of human endurance and the folly of ignoring nature's warnings. If you found this story haunting, consider subscribing to Doomed Expeditions. We explore history's most tragic journeys so you don't have to live them. Subscribe now.